slight difference. You may be missing someone. So Louise is unable to come today, but she has entrusted the session to myself and Josh. And we're really excited because we both love the book. I've done what Louise usually does. I've got about 700 post-its. This is actually an office copy, so apologies to anyone who wants to read this after me. So as most of you know, I'm Sophie. I've been at Volans for nearly a year now, and I've been helping to develop the book club, and I am just incredibly proud of the community. And so I'm really excited, if slightly terrified, to try a different role this week. And someone you haven't met before is Josh, who is a regular to the book club, but I'll let Josh introduce himself.
Thanks, Sophie. Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you all. I think some of you I've met, others I haven't. I'm a fairly new addition to the Volans team. So I started in January and have had a whirlwind of 5 months, enjoyed it a lot. And yeah, I'm really excited to be co-hosting today with Sophie and having the wonderful Katie Patrick here to talk about her book and her work more widely. I guess one place to start, as some of you may know, we recently did a offsite to Mallorca as a team to practice some team building exercises. And during this trip, we were really confronted with the question of how to build trust and safety within our organization to develop ourselves as individuals, but also develop Volans and the team and the work that we do. And these are two core tenets of the book that I think, these are two tenets that are really exciting today because both of us have been trusted with helping and running the book club today, which is very exciting. But enough on that, let's move on to Katie, who we're all here to hear talk today. And I know some of you have read the book, and I hope some of you have listened to her podcast because it's absolutely wonderful. And Katie starts her podcast usually asking the same question to guests. So we thought in that fashion, it'd be quite good to start by asking Katie her own question. And the question is, in sustainability and climate change, a lot of people haven't heard of the social sciences and environmental psychology. What are the problems we are up against? And why aren't we bringing this psychology into the core of our research? So, Katie, to you, we have two questions. What does environmental psychology mean to you? And what made you realize it was missing from more traditional approaches?
Well, yeah, thank you. I've asked so many PhD environmental psychologists that question. I should be able to succinctly answer it now, or at least just copy what they said. So what is environmental psychology? I mean, it's basically the study of how humans relate to environmental behaviors. There's another branch of environmental psychology which has got to do with architecture, like if you're in a red room, like how does that make you feel? But I don't do that sort of environmental psychology. And I personally think they really need to have different names. So the type of environmental psychology I do is how people psychologically and behaviorally relate to environmental behaviors, and how can you design interventions and tools and messages that basically tap right into the motivational core of people and actually get them to do stuff. So I realized that there was this phenomenon called the value action gap that I discovered about 10 years ago. I was actually trying to write a book on how you could change the world with what you buy. I started a media company, and I actually met John Elkington in Oxford probably like 15 years ago. He probably doesn't remember me, but I remember you, John. Hi. Back at that time, I was really interested in promoting eco-friendly products. I really thought if we could just sort of shift the economy and get people to buy more green stuff and less not green stuff, you could change everything. And I was trying to write a book about that. And the deeper I studied it, the more that theory started to fall apart. The more I realized that just looking at consumer behavior was actually a really weak driver, and that eco-labels didn't necessarily work very well. And even ecological calls to action, like do it for the environment, do it for the earth, weren't very strong, like when you looked into the behavioral sciences. But the thing is that there were all these other mechanisms that were really powerful. And so in trying to sort of write this book and come up with this thesis, it kind of fell apart the more I delved into it. But in this process of trying to really articulate, like, why should you do stuff for the planet? Not just because of the planet as this objective ecosystem, but really why as a person, like the deepest spiritual soul, psychological drivers that I could like hook somebody into a story, hook into this deeper meaning. that's the place that I came to in trying to illustrate this narrative, and asking like much deeper questions, like, are we doing it because we want to be altruistic? Are we do it because our sense of identity or ego, or are we doing it because we're copying other people? It kind of takes you into this realm. And then I discovered my first academic paper on environmental psychology, which was really delving into, you know, why altruism is not a very good way to get people to take action, but what you should do instead is use this thing called the responsible person. People really like to identify as being responsible, and so that's really a good way to get to people. But if you go through an altruistic lens, you're kind of working with this unforeseen dichotomy that, you know, if one person's altruistic, then another person is kind of like a bad person. So you're almost saying that some people are bad and some people are good because they're altruistic, which gets into this kind of like murky waters that can put people off. And in this study, like, I was just hooked. I was like, oh my God, this is explaining everything I've been trying to figure out. And then I discovered this journal of environmental psychology that explained all of these different concepts about like social norms and social imitation, and how you know, goal-seeking behavior and the dopamine reward system. And I mean, it's a big complex field. There's so much to it. And I was just hooked on it. I was like, this is explaining everything I've been trying to do for my whole career. Like, how do we actually convince people? How do we get them to do it? And the reason why this is so important for us as sustainability practitioners is because, you know, our role is trying to psychologically convince people to do this stuff. And if we don't understand the nature of the human mind, of how the human mind sort of grabs onto concepts, grabs onto behaviors, grabs onto ideologies, like, we can't promote sustainability. Like, this is the wall we're up against. I mean, most of us in the space have engineering or science degrees. We know what we need to do. There's so many like carbon roadmaps, you know, like we know practically and functionally what we need to do. The hurdle is in the psychology of trying to hook people in, change their behavior, change their state of mind, their ideologies, and have this, you know, spread like through a tipping point. And this is what the environmental psychology has to teach us. And I just think it's a tragedy that it's not more well known. I mean, I'd already been doing it. I was in my early 30s when I first figured it out, you know, and like, I was right into sustainability since I was like, you know, 16 or 17. I mean, it's really not getting out there. And everybody who's doing sustainability, unless you're doing like pure scientific research, like, we are in the job of changing minds. Most people, it is what you have to do. You have to change people's minds and get them to do stuff differently. So this environmental psychology really does need to be at the core of our profession, unless you have like a 100% technical role, which some people do, but I think most of us don't have 100% technical roles.
I think that's really interesting about the technicality, because I know you've had like an incredible career so far of just the companies and organizations you've worked with, Google, NASA, the UN. They're all quite different, and obviously some of them seem really technical. And I think most people can understand the technicalities of behavioral psychology, but what's your experience been working with all those different companies? How do you approach it differently based on sort of whether they're an NGO or a sort of corporate policymaker?
Well, the little bit, I mean, I only ever get to work on one sort of tiny cog of something, right? So the little bit that I get given is different in every different scenario. But what I do, which is this behavior map that I sent out last week, which I hope everybody would have a copy of, is I worked out this process of behavior mapping that I learned when I came to Silicon Valley and tried to, you know, really got into building software, which it's called user story mapping. Any user interface designer or software designer learns how to do this. And it's also kind of works for behavior design. So I took the user story mapping process and I started to kind of like augment it with more like gamification and game design techniques, and also these environmental behavioral interventions, and kind of like expanded it a bit. And what's really powerful about the user story mapping sort of / behavior mapping process is it takes us, you know, instead of just looking at sort of like sustainability, like this like big nebulous thing that we just kind of like gotta like just get people to do, which usually is like literally like thousands of things, to like strip it right down, super reductive, and just basically make a path, right, of what the behaviors that people are going to do. Because if you're designing an app or a piece of software, you have to be incredibly like reductive and specific and surgical about what each of these steps are going to be, because a computer programmer has to actually write it in code. So if you're not like really, really detailed about what each step, what each button, you know, what each link is going to do, the programmer isn't going to know what they need to they design. So, you know, with behaviors, we need to think the same way. So the first step is to just think about like, what is the number that you want to change, which might sound incredibly obvious, like, oh, of course we're trying to change like climate, you know, or forests or waste or whatever. But in almost every time, people have not thought this through. You know, they're trying to change carbon, but they're adding it up in kilowatts. You know, they're trying to reduce emissions, but they're looking at a ratio between like wind and coal. Like it's like not like exactly the right metric that is probably telling the story the best. Or they're trying to get, you know, rid of waste, but they're looking at the ratio of recycling. Like, or they're just looking at like 10 different things, you know, which is scrambling like the whole thing. So we're trying to figure out the exact one most meaningful metric in real numbers, not in like likes or follows or shares or revenue or whatever, like the actual environmental data. And then you ask a simple question, like, who is the person that you want to get out to? Like, who are they? Is it like a student or a teacher or a CEO or somebody who owns a house? Like, be very specific about the person that you want to get out to. And if there's multiple people, you just go through the process multiple times, right? And then this is where the magic sort of comes into this process, is you ask the question like, well, how will they first see it? And I guarantee you, like, nobody does it this way. Nobody says, before you've even got an idea, before you've even built anything out, like, how will they first find out about it? And then when you ask that question, how will they first find out about it? Like, that changes everything. Like, will they find out about it because it's like a digital wall? Like, they walk into Whole Foods and they see like a digital screen, or will they find out about it through a conversation, you know, through a one worker to another worker? Will they find out about it through a letter? Will it be like a text message? And so in my behavior mapping process, I have about maybe 15 different ways that you can like get to people. You know, it can be like social media, all these different ways. And then when you think about that way, like, you're like, oh, like, how will they actually, like, first they go from never ever seeing your intervention or your idea or startup or campaign to seeing it. What is that step? And you start with that, right? And then you have to look about how will you hook them in, you know, what will be the story, where how will you like grab their attention and kind of like hook them in? Then what data sets are we working with? Then how will you actually like ask them to do the behavior or cue the behavior? Like, you know, with seatbelts, we have a like a chime. You know, if you don't have the seatbelt on, there's like a chime that goes off. The chime is the cue to get you to do it. So, you know, if you're trying to get someone to do an eco behavior, a chime might be a way to signal to somebody to actually do the behavior. And then you would work out what is the action, not like 10 actions, not we want you to like, oh, turn the lights off and recycle and plant a tree, you know, like, and save the whales and get an electric car and ride your bike less and go organic. You know, we're just like giving people like all this like kind of like tips and stuff, and change your career and figure out your investment, your pension fund. So it's in a, like an ethical fund, you know, just get like the one specific, or one action, maybe 3 at the most if they're related, you know, action, and then get them to do the action. And then there are all these different psychological nudge techniques that you can use. Like, do you put people in like a leaderboard? Do you add a color to it? You know, do you add like smiley faces? And there's like about 30 of them that you can choose. And then you build in, you know, like a reward system. Like, after they've done it, is there some kind of reward? And can you get people to do it in groups and talk to each other? And so anyway, just to answer the question, what I do is basically take anything through the same process. Who is the person? You know, how do you get out to them? What do you want them to do? How do we add basically like psychology to get people to do it more? Because often just asking them for the planet is not enough. And reward system. And you can sort of use that for anything, whether it's like the urban heat islands that I worked on, you know, with NASA, or the biodiversity projects with the UN, or getting, you know, measuring indoor air quality for schools in Ireland, like another thing. It's like the same process. You can just use it just for anything that you want to do, to really basically shred down a very complicated, big, messy topic into a highly specific action that will get a response from somebody.
That was a brilliant synopsis of the book. Thank you for that, Katie. And I know that's one of the reasons why we really kind of resonated with the book. It was the practicality and really honing in on that kind of one action, one measurement. I think what was just rising up in my head there, which would be really interesting. So you talk about the behavior mapping. with the book, did you have an intended audience? And did you find that you managed to reach this intended audience? And did they receive it well? Were there any surprises with kind of where your book, or actually your work more widely, has resonated?
With the audience, I mean, not really. I mean, ideally, I would want, you know, professional sustainability practitioners that I feel like they're only functioning at maybe like a 5 or a 6 out of 10 of the impact that they could have, that if they added all this type of knowledge, you know, it could get up to like, you know, like an 8 or a 10 out of 10 of their own potential. I mean, that was kind of my ideal audience to get out to. But no, I mean, I didn't really write or produce the book with a kind of like a specific big marketing or career intention. I just accumulated all of this really interesting research that I'd found, and I'd kind of like squished it into a PowerPoint presentation. And I just wanted to be able to convey it more succinctly. But it was a bit of a mess. And I thought, oh, well, I better like tidy it all up and sort of like put it into a book and put some diagrams, you know, so this stuff makes sense to people, because I'm just like rambling at people at parties being like, oh my God, you should, you know, if you did this and you did that and look at disclosure theory and look up that, you know, research. And I just wanted to just really sort of like tidy it up into something succinct that, you know, I could have available to just sort of show this body of knowledge to people. So, you know, just to kind of distill like what I do and what I'm interested in. In terms of who it gets out to, I mean, one thing that's been challenging about the book, doing something about environmental psychology and gamification, is that pretty much nobody has ever heard of environmental psychology or gamification. So in terms of putting something out, it's a little bit hard to put out on a topic that your target audience has never heard of. Like, for example, if you wrote a book about like weight loss, and there are a lot of people already looking up like how to lose weight, right? So you can sort of go into like a pre-existing need. So in terms of my role, it's really been a lot of work and a lot of deep thought into I have to almost like communicate the gap that people don't know that they have the gap. You know what I mean? Like, I have to let people know that they're missing something that they don't even know they're missing. So it's a huge amount of like groundwork instead of getting out to different not-for-profits and government groups and professional bodies to get them for the penny to drop, that there is this like huge missing piece in the way that we're going about sustainability. So in that way, like getting this book and this knowledge out, it's kind of like slow going, like sort of like one group at a time, you know, like, you know, what is environmental psychology? We've never heard of environmental psychology. How can we apply gamification? You know, what are data feedback loops? You know, what is the reward system of the brain? There's the real neuroscience and the dopamine system. Of like trying to like, you know, like get that message out. It's really like a whole different like paradigm way of thinking about sustainability that doesn't exist. But I do have to say, like, even though it is a little bit of a slow journey to get it recognized, when it is recognized, it's just like all like the fireworks go off, you know, like with the UN, they're all just like, oh my God, this is the most amazing book we've ever seen. We have to get you to work on everything. This is phenomenal. And people send me these letters saying that they were doing their whole NGO this way, and then they just like they just stopped the way they were doing it, and then they just had to take like a year off everything because they realized they were doing it all wrong, and now they've started again, and now they're having all this impact. So it's like a very high value rewarding an impact when the penny drops, but a little bit slow going to sort of to get there.
I think so. When you sort of approach, you were saying you sort of would quite like sustainability practitioners to sort of read this book or work with you to sort of move the action level from a 6 to a 10. One thing that really struck me was sort of the optimism in the book, and I know you've done some TED Talks about this as well. I never viewed myself as a particularly pessimistic person when it came to environmental issues. I always thought that sort of we can still do something, but it was only when I read that sentence where you said that when we act from a place of fear, 30% of our brain stops working, and it's like looking for a pinpoint. And I sort of realized that actually I think we can do something, but I'm in the back of my mind, I kind of think we're screwed. And reading that kind of gave me permission just for a second to imagine what the world could be like if I was just purely optimistic. I was wondering how that's been received by the sort of sustainability practitioners who you talk to. Is it difficult to break that sort of inherent pessimism, or not fear-mongering, but sort of I do feel like it's more warning than sort of proactive encouragement.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting, topic, is this relationship between sort of optimism and having a vision, and how that can be conflated with perhaps not taking any of the issues seriously. So what was really funny is after I put my TED talk out, and it was just one TED talk, not multiple, Sophie, so anyone who hasn't seen my TED talk, it's like, I think it's about as like innocent and friendly as you could get. It basically says, let's not get down in the dumps about the whole like sort of doom about climate change. Let's imagine a beautiful future. Let's bring creativity and imagination to, imagine the ecotopia that we would want, right? There was a few people that got really upset about me and sent me these really nasty, vicious messages about how dare I, dilute the serious of the cause, and this kind of like naive, sort of optimistic, like how dare you have optimistic creativity in the face of, such serious issue, and really kind of nasty about it. And I was like, wow, like I didn't think that this message could possibly get somebody off side. It's so kind of simple and innocent. So that happened a little bit, but that was one sort of a little bit more of like a spiky issue. But the one thing that does come up is that is a more reasonable thing, which is, if you are optimistic, does that mean that you are just sort of naively blind to what is going on? And so the one thing to think about, like having optimism and creativity and vision for a future, like for example, the building that is behind me, like is a basic creative technical process. If you're an architect and somebody asks you to design an eco-city, you need to be able to imagine it. If you want to have a zero waste future, you need to be able to imagine what that is. Not imagination in this naive way, but in a technical, creative way. Like you need to actually be able to design it. And people can sometimes conflate what I'm saying with the cognitive error of magical thinking. Magical thinking is when you believe something that isn't true. Like you believe that there's a romantic partner out there for you, someone that you're in love with that really doesn't like you, and people engage in magical thinking. Like, for example, if people are in love with celebrities, they think that maybe they'll meet them in their soulmate. That's magical thinking, right? Imagining an ecotopia future is not magical thinking. It's a design process. It's coming up with a vision, it's coming up with a goal, and it's being able to visualize the details of that goal. And then it's also activating the dopamine system, because dopamine is a system that drives us to achieve goals. And then we get a reward. Our own internal reward mechanism is that sort of dopamine from that. So we come up with goals, we come up with sort of future scenarios that we're attracted to, and then we activate the dopamine system, which can take us along these very, very long time scales that it would take. Like, for example, it might take 10 years to build a building like this to get there. And we need the vision, ideally, like an optimistic vision, to help activate that, right? And so that's really what I'm trying to talk about when I'm talking about optimism and vision. It is by no means ignoring what's going on, and it is not magical thinking, and it's not denial. It's not denial at all. And in terms of what you mentioned in the context of like, are we screwed or are we not? I mean, in my personal feeling towards my own visions of ecotopia, it's not even really that relevant to like the path or the future prediction of what the Earth is on. Like there are multiple climate scenarios or environmental scenarios that can play out. Whether I want to build, like spend my life doing sustainability, ecotopia stuff, like whether the Earth turns out sort of okay or not okay is not particularly relevant. Like I'm still going to do it. If I want to build an eco city and I want to put up solar panels and I want to do permaculture gardens, like I'm still going to do it anyway. So perhaps the issue of, like future, the degree of future apocalypse that we end up in is not even really like the same topic. Like I'm not predicting the future. I'm basically saying, here's a vision of something I want to do, and I'm going to make it happen. I'm going to activate my dopamine system to make this vision happen. Like that's it. No one in this story is trying to predict the future and say the future is going to be fine. It's about how we, manufacture the future that we want.
That makes me think of, I was in a meeting this morning and someone defined optimism in a really lovely way. They said that it's having hope and taking action. And I think that sums up kind of how you've explained that there really well. I'd love to move on to this idea of visualization, because I know that's a part that you talk about in the book. And you talk about how athletes use visualization to perform at the highest of their ability. And it made me start thinking about net zero and actually how I struggle to visualize something such as net zero. And I think a lot of corporations who have signed up to net zero targets haven't really visualized what it actually means for them in their industry, in the geographies that they operate. So I'd be really interested to know, when you're doing a visualization into the future, as you say, how do you go about bringing that together? And kind of, because there could be so many different pathways. Did you have any advice for us who might not be as experienced at the visualization process to kind of start that way of thinking?
Yeah, well, the visualization can be just it can come in different ways, right? Like it can be a really technical idea storming, data-driven thing, right? Which is you have you take out a piece of paper, with a zero in it, you want zero. You really deeply understand your data, and then you mind map how you would get there. Like, okay, we want to get rid of all the cars, right? We want to get rid of all of the petroleum fueled cars. How do we do that? And then you're just like, okay, well, I suppose we could get here, we could do that, maybe we could get this bit, and you're just like mind mapping. In the book, I have an exercise of coming up with 100 ideas, which is something that I do every time I'm stuck, even if it's in just my personal life, or I want to have like a creative breakthrough, because we often think that ideas are this limited resource, and that maybe you can only come up with like 2 or 3 ideas. If somebody gives you like the instructions, like you have to actually come up with 100 ideas, it's actually pretty easy to come up with 100 ideas. Like sometimes you get stuck at about 50, and then you're just like, okay. It's just that difference in framing for your sort of mental aptitude is really quite amazing. Sometimes I'm doing this and I even get up to like 120 or 130. Like you just keep going and going, right? So that's the kind of like a data-driven way to do it. Then you can also do it like a more visually creative way. And I do this with these imagination workshops where we get a picture of like an urban environment that is not nice, an ugly, decrepit, gray urban environment. And then we take it into Canva or Photoshop and then like cover it with like grass and trees. And people just have this kind of like almost like transcendental experience. It has a really deeply powerful emotional effect on people, just doing this kind of like artistic sort of reimagining of an urban space. And then another way you can do it is through like a guided meditation where, you go for 45 minutes. I actually have one on my podcast, a guided meditation for reimagining the world. And that's more for, trying to just enhance your, emotional resiliency, find your emotional power, find that kind of like the energy inside you to keep doing this work. So, visualization and creative imagining can just, it can cover like the full spectrum from, engineering, all the way to like sort of spiritual transcendence. But there's just sort of like 3 ways, that you can do it. Just mind map, take a photo, take it into Canva, and start putting plants on top of it. You can do meditations on it. The interesting academic research in the space showed that getting people for, I think it was like 15 minutes or 30 minutes to write ideas and draw a picture of a sustainable future got people to increase their, environmental political activism and their environmental behavior. And the thing that was most interesting about the study was that they had 2 groups, right? I mean, apart from the control. One group, they just got to absorb the information, like they had to read a paragraph. They saw a picture of a sustainable city and then they read a paragraph that somebody else had written. Now, the other group, they had to write the paragraph themselves. They had to like got a piece of paper and people would write things like it would have wind turbines and it would have solar panels. Now, it was the group that did it themselves, which shows us that actively engaging in our own ideation, our own, creative kind of like idea storming kind of like is a behavioral nudge. So I think in a lot of this stuff, we're having this one-way communication street, like, oh, this is what we need to do. Let me show you like how to do this, right? A more powerful way, this research shows, is actually just like asking other people to come up with the ideas, you know, get them to come up with it. And that will lead to the behaviors much more than it just being like a one-way, you know, like a documentary or a book that just sort of tells you what to do.
I think that leads really well into, Pooja has just asked a question in the chat. So he says, Ecotopia as a tool sounds amazing. What I find is that we often center our ecotopias around our favorite solutions. This would be technological for Elon Musk and nature-based for me. There's a gap between what a solution can really do versus what we can imagine it can do. And then he qualifies that by saying nature-based solutions alone wouldn't be sufficient to save the world. And he asks what your suggestions would be on making your individual ecotopias realistic. And I suppose I'd add to that, is there a conflict when you're sort of imagining what you can do and what your future can be? So my imagined future might be really different to Josh's. And in terms of practicalities, how does that work? If we both want to produce the same thing, we both produce it, but if everyone on the planet does that and none of them combine, how do we find that synergy?
I tell you what, I think if we're ever still alive in a world where like there's arguments between which version of the Ecotopia is actually going to happen and which one is the most realistic, like that would be pretty amazing. I feel like we're way baby steps, you know, before ever even getting there. I mean, I just think the place we're at right now with like, you know, the zeitgeist and where the profession is and the sort of people are at. I mean, this just knowing that there is such thing as a sort of a solar punk ecotopia biophilic alternative, like most people have never ever seen that before. Like they've never seen a picture like this. Any kind of like green wall, green roof. Like I talk about green walls and green roofs a lot. A lot of people don't even know what a green wall or a green roof is. Like they've just never heard the word and they've never seen one. So I think like, yeah, like let's just get to a stage where people have actually like seen it and heard of it. And then maybe at one point, you know, if there's a building, people can argue about, you know, which is the most realistic. You know, I mean, anyone who's been on like a green building engineering team, you know, like they're the conversations everybody's having, like how to size the solar panels, to size the insulation, you know, the thermal properties of the building. Like you can get into the engineering of it when you have like a real project to work on.
I'm just going to add, I think Carrie's point feeds into that. You were saying lots of people haven't ever seen a green wall. Do you think of the work you've done, what sort of has inspired people to take action more? Sort of the visual things or the written work or a combination? What sort of, I suppose, what in your projects has been the most successful in your experience?
I mean, it's a little bit hard to say because they're all a bit different. But I was enormously impressed by what happened after doing these really simple before and after workshops. So I have this thing a group I set up called the Imagine Project, and it's at katiepatrick.com/imagine. You can sign up there and you can get this like sort of kits and downloads and stuff. And I think I've only held 4 of these workshops now. I only started doing it like late about December last year, where we take these photos and then people who have like never done graphic design and not landscape architects or green building engineers, and then, you know, sort of like greenify the concrete or whatever. And the intention of these workshops was like, I just wanted to do it for fun. Like I just wanted to get people together and just do this because I thought it was cool. Like it was not intended to lead to action, maybe in the future, but not when I started it. But then what happened is multiple people who joined in on the workshops then got back to me like a couple of weeks later that said that they'd, you know, contacted their local cities. They'd put a proposal together based on like the like simplest like artwork. I'm looking like really, really simple stuff. And, you know, they were giving like presentations to their local city about nature-based solutions. And I was just like, this is like phenomenal. And then, but also just saying like, I really loved the workshop. I hope I can do more of it. I felt changed by it. There was just something about like asking people to reimagine this visual space that had a psychological salience to it that I had not seen in anything else I'd done. So that was kind of like in that realm, right? But that kind of imagination realm is a bit of a different realm. The other realm that I've worked a lot in is like energy saving in buildings. And so it's like a totally different, perhaps like mental mechanism, which is using, you know, color to get people to change their energy patterns. So we made a Chrome extension called Energy Lollipop that shows the carbon emissions that your home is producing. This is carbon emissions, not kilowatt hours, they're different. And from what I could tell, it was like the first app anybody had done in communicating actual carbon, not kilowatt hours, because everybody always says everything in kilowatt hours and therms for gas. And it really showed it, you know, in color and, you know, using social comparison, very, very powerful, especially telling people they are below average. Nothing seems to sketch people out and make them want to change their behavior like being told that they are doing below average. And then also getting that red color instead of getting like a green color when they're doing better. So, you know, comparing people, giving people the smiley face, showing people the data in a feedback loop, tracking progress towards a goal, you know, that's really powerful. Like, here's your goal. Your goal is to cut your CO2 by 50%. Let's track the progress towards the goal. That's a basic gamification mechanism. And when I put all these together in a way that was nicely designed, it looks really beautiful. It's well built. We were getting between like a 40 and a 70% reduction in CO2, whereas the industry standard for this type of thing is sort of like between like 3 and 8% reduction for like smart meter interfaces. So it really worked. And I did a whole lot of qualitative interviews with people, meaning like just talking for an hour over Zoom about their experience with it. And the combination of the color and the social comparison, like showing people how much they compare to average, is just like, it's just a killer like system. Like, we have the traffic lights, we have smiley faces, frowny faces, and we tell you how much you compare to average. And I just think that basic combination you can apply to anything and it will get people to shift. It'll get all the people who are below average to desperately want to be above average. And I don't think that they need to have any environmental sensibilities to do it. I think people just really, really don't want to be below average, no matter what it is.
I think that's really, really interesting, because you're talking there a lot about the competitive side of human nature. And it's quite interesting in this space. We talk a lot about collaborating and actually trying to move away from competition. But here you're kind of promoting the competitive side. So it'll be really interesting to know, how do you see those two kind of working together, moving from the competitiveness of a leaderboard to push behavior change to then actually moving towards actually collaborating to kind of cause a greater change?
Yeah, well, I think when that question gets asked, we need to ask ourselves, like, is it really, you know, like a dichotomy? Is that a false dichotomy that there's one or the other? Like, you can't be, you know, competitive or, you know, and collaborative at the same time. And some of the research in this space is interesting, is that it doesn't, just because you rank people in terms of data. So let's not use the word competition. Let's just say we have a data set and we're ranking people. So it's basically disclosure of data. We're disclosing the nature of the data. And whether people interpret that competitively or not is kind of like up to them, right? So our job is to just disclose the data and to show people, you know, like in a bell curve, you know, or in order. So some people might become very collaborative about that. They would be like, oh, look, here's all our data. Here's where everybody sits. You know, why is this person doing well and that person doing badly? Or why are they an outlier? You know, what's going on here? And then the group then works together to improve the performance of the whole group, right? People could work that way. And then, you know, some people might be particularly competitive, but, you know, humans basically are constantly evaluating themselves as to their position in a group. Like, it's just something that we basically, it's like core in the way that we think. We can't not do it. Even if you're comparing like which apple to buy, like the better apple or the worse apple, the nature of comparison is how we make all decisions. So it's really tapping into that decision-making mechanism, you know, in the way humans think. Yeah, and so like people don't necessarily like compete, and also like people have different personality types. So about a quarter of people are genuinely really competitive. They will get very moved by the leaderboard and they will really, really want to move up the leaderboard. And other people just really, really won't care about the leaderboard. So, you know, it's kind of like making it for different personality types. And then other people will be, you know, interested in, you know, some other type of mechanism, you know, like in the UI design.
I think just building on that, it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on, so moving into kind of the gamification. And I know from personal experience, I quite like a gamification process. I wouldn't say I'm necessarily competitive, but I like playing the game, being compared against other people. And in lockdown, I really got into the app Strava. I love seeing kind of all my stats, seeing the data. But what I saw was quite interesting was I was really I had a behavior change for a short period of time. So I had a change of opinion, a change of behavior. But I struggled to necessarily make that a habit. And over time, the behavior change has slipped down and I'm probably not using it as much as possible. So it'd be awesome to hear kind of, how do you suggest that when you get someone hooked into a new behavior, to sustain it and keep it kind of fresh and relevant, and stop them kind of slipping back to their previous, maybe not so eco-friendly habits, because they're not so aware of it after 6 months, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting topic that you bring up, you know, which does happen with, you know, like gamification and apps and interventions, is that they're cool, like while they're a novelty, right? But then they get boring. And then, you know, it's unlikely that it's going to work after maybe like 2 or 4 weeks. So, I mean, I've never done anything with a group of people that I've just consistently monitored over like multiple years. So all I can answer it in a way is kind of like how I think it maybe can be done. So I think in terms of any kind of like gamification intervention, you probably need to plan for it to only ever be like a novelty factor. Like you should plan for it to have a shelf life of maybe a month, you know, maybe 3 months if you're really lucky, because like nobody's going to be like constantly, well, maybe they will, but you know, like constantly checking something and constantly into it, you know, like after that sort of initial, you know, kind of like fun of it. But ideally is you want to have it move into something that is going to be more permanent. Maybe it's a behavior, but maybe it's like a change, you know, like you get in like a heat pump hot water system, or you get an electric car and it's only meant to do one thing. Like it's only meant to get you to, you know, switch your car or get you to give away your car for a bike or something like that. So it's there for a purpose, right? Or if it's trying to get something like an ongoing behavior, you know, like composting, then I think you need to really work on the like intrinsic, you know, motivators, like that deeper kind of environmental understanding and identity, and get people together in groups. You know, like people do things because they believe it's the group norm. You know, basically, from what I feel like I understand now, people basically copy what the group around them is doing, and they want to do better than the average of the group. There are these like two kind of things, like imitating other people and want to be doing just basically not worse than average. And so sort of copying and comparison, right? So something like composting, which you do in your own home, but if you believe that everybody around you also composts, then you're going to want to compost, right? So you might be able to do like a little, like, you know, like compost challenge for like 5 days, sticker chart. That would be like your little gamification intervention. You know, and then maybe like, I don't know, you photograph your compost and then like someone sends you like a smiley face, I don't know, something like that. And then that's only going to work for like a little snapshot of time, but how do you maintain that? Getting people to believe that everybody else around them is doing it. So like in your apartment complex, do you know that like 7 out of 10 people compost? And if they don't, you can use this thing called dynamic norms, which says more and more people are composting, even though it's like a tiny percentage. And, you know, getting people into groups. Like if you could get people into groups and getting them to talk about it and then like copy each other, and then getting, you know, a few people that are real fans of the behavior, like I compost, it's really great. And another person's like, yeah, I'm really into it too. Then the other people will copy them. So everything needs to be in the context of how everybody believes everyone else is thinking. Like if you believe that everyone else supports like climate renewable energy policy, you will support climate renewable energy policy, not so much from your own objective point of view, but just because you think that everyone else is doing it, so you'll do it too. You know, it's like getting that message to people that basically like, yeah, everybody's doing it now. Like that's kind of like I think the message to get through to people.
I think like that makes a lot of sense to me on an individual level. I think there's a question from Susan who said, have you done this with companies and aligned all the various teams around the necessary behavior change? And I suppose that kind of links more to a systems thinking perspective. I know sort of Davos is going on at the moment, so I'm very aware that sort of there's all these countries and all these delegations, but can we ever actually, are they ever going to be aligned on the same thing? And how can we get them aligned on the same thing? Because is that what needs to happen? And if so, how does gamification play into that? Because that's a group of people, and they're individuals, but we need that collective action, and they want to stand out.
No, I've never worked for any large companies and gotten their employees to engage in sort of environmental behaviors. It's not the kind of like framework that I kind of work with. The nature of the type of style of design I do, well, partly it's more, it's been more software design centric. But also that I'm interested in doing is like looking at the whole like sort of system of players, kind of like football teams in a game. And I haven't really been drawn to working with large corporations, and they have also not really found me or like sought me out. Because I think once you're in like one single company, like say if it's like just Nike, right? Like there's a limit to what you can do there. And the thing that I'm really interested in doing is like, how can I apply something to, say, for example, like with the shoe companies, to all the shoe companies. So if all the shoe companies are like the football teams and the game is shoes, how could I give every shoe a kind of like a system and a disclosure so they're all playing together in the game? So I worked for the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, designing disclosure labels for them, which then all of their members were meant to have. I'm not sure where it's at now, that project. But, you know, that's what I'm really interested in doing, is how do we signal all of the players in the game, not just one single corporation? So not that there's not a whole lot of like really interesting sustainability work to be done in corporations. It's just not the style of work that I've done or that I really want to do. I'm more like sort of like the bird's eye lens.
And just building on to Carrie's put a question here about the non-believers and the climate deniers, does the theory of kind of the majority moving in a certain direction, does that affect climate deniers and kind of the incumbents? Or do they, from your experiences, let's say with the composting, will there still be just say 10, 15% who just go, no, I don't care, I'm not going to get involved? Have you seen any change there?
I mean, I've never done like a deep dive into the climate denial psychology, so I can't say that I really know sort of what is going on with them, and then what works for those type of people, and then what doesn't work for those for those types of people. But all I can say is that generally, like all social change moves through this nature of like the tipping point, right? So you get like your early innovators that get into stuff, and then, you know, those really 1% of early innovators, they get like the next, whatever the next one is called, like the next like 10%, you know, and then they get the early majority in, and then you've got like the late majority, kind of like your last, you know, 40% or whatever, that will only do it when 50% of people are doing it already. So this is like just sort of like the nature of people's personality profiles. You know, some people just love to be like ahead of the curve. They love to be really innovative. And they're the people that will kind of pull everyone else along, right? And other people, they will not want to do anything unless, like, they have to be with the majority of people. They really only feel safe when they're doing something that maybe 60 or 70% of people around them are doing. So they'll only come on when they really, really feel secure. So if you see all change through that, and this goes into this like system versus individual change dichotomy, people are always like, oh, why look at individual psychology when we need like systems change? It's like, well, wherever it happens, it still happens like through this curve, right? You need individual people kind of like massaging the system, making it normal. At some point, you'll get some government policy in, and then maybe some larger corporations or systems will do something in the sort of systems change. But then often like the government policy and legislation can come quite late. Like it could come 20 years along this, you know, particular sort of like tipping point and cycle. So when I see the people that are sort of like holding the movement back, you know, like the climate deniers and stuff, I just kind of don't really think about it, and I don't really worry about it, because I'm more thinking about the front end of the tipping point of like trying to like push that bit forward, because I figure all those people will just sort of fall like dominoes anyway at the point when they will, right? You can't go direct to them. You know, you got to start with the innovators and sort of pull everybody along, kind of like a train, you know, they're at the back end of the train, and they'll eventually just sort of like, they'll sort of come along, but it doesn't feel like it's that useful to be worrying about the back end of the train that are the most difficult people, when we've got like so much to do at the front of the train to get the front of the train sort of moving forward.
So sort of, if we're all trying to reduce carbon, say, and it's one action and we're trying to get a herd mentality with lots of people and we're not worrying about the stragglers, is there a risk that sort of moves into sort of herd mentality, and is that a bad thing, herd mentality?
I don't know, what is herd mentality? I mean, I don't really know what that is. I mean, humans already, I mean, we adopt our belief systems usually based on, you know, what people around us, you know, believe. I don't know, it's kind of getting into some like pretty tricky ground. I think that's probably a better question for like Steven Pinker, who specializes in rationality, because it's kind of a question of like, do you adopt your belief systems and attitudes, you know, based on your pure rational objective thought, or on your you're adopting kind of like the beliefs and the ideologies of those around you, right? Like all of us in sustainability, I mean, we still adopt all of our beliefs, our sort of left-leaning, you know, eco-centric beliefs from the groups and the people around us. I mean, we do it too. So rather than perhaps really having the super shrewd critical thinking hat on, where we're just only 100% data-driven and evidence-based all of the time. I mean, if that's really sort of like, you know, the question, I mean, I don't know. We all need sort of critical thinking. We need to, you know, teach and have a society that adopts rationality and critical thinking. And we should probably all follow. I'm just a huge fan of Steven Pinker and his books and critical thought. But the nature of how humans spread ideologies and identities and what's normal is, you know, through our groups, through our sense of like, you know, what is normal now. It's one of those questions that, you know, if it's like a bad thing, you know, like should people have guns, or should we dislike people of different, you know, races or religions, we kind of think, oh, herd mentality, that's so bad, we don't want that. But then it's like, well, if we're adopting, you know, solar panels and growing our own fruits and vegetables, do we want this to be adopted as a norm? Everybody's like, oh yeah, of course we want sharing. Of course we want like growing your own vegetables to be shared and to be normal. I mean, it's one of those things that you can just like, if you just insert what the issue is, it changes the question dramatically. But I think the, you know, the objective truth is that it's just how humans work. Like we copy the beliefs, identities, and behaviors of people around us.
I'd like to just while you were speaking there, something really resonated with me, and it was from your podcast with Professor Jan. I'm gonna butcher this last name, but Bolderjik, I think.
Bolderdijk.
Sorry.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, I scrambled it way worse the first time.
And it was this idea of kind of the interaction between individual action and system change. And you touched upon it there really nicely, how there's a lot of focus at the moment on system change, but actually you need both. You need the individual to almost come before the systematic change, because say a government, I think in the podcast you were saying, a government won't introduce a policy unless there's been action taken by individuals to show that it will be popular. And I guess we were both talking earlier about how we think you're a very courageous person, and you have an attitude of kind of, you see an issue, you think about it, you take an action, and then you kind of reflect on it. And a great example was your Green Page environmental publishing initiative, and how you talk about that in the book, and said basically after 5 or so years, it just wasn't achieving what you wanted it to achieve. So you said, okay, enough, move on to the next step. I'd be really interested to know kind of where you think your courage comes from, and how can you speak to kind of some people on the call here, how they can be more courageous in their own personal lives, and whether they're working for an NGO or a business, to kind of lead the change?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I do have a higher risk tolerance, a much higher risk tolerance than most people. You know, I'm okay with doing something where I don't earn any money for 3 years just because it's interesting to me, or, you know, moving or living somewhere that's not so nice. All these type of things. Yeah, I don't know. I'll let's turn the call into like a personal therapy session about like how I got the way I am. I mean, it was just, I mean, what I can say to people, because everybody does have like a different, you know, personality that's driven, you know, by like ideas and novelty and challenges and risk. And I wouldn't want to like force like what I do that fits for my personality on somebody else. I don't think we should do that. We should reflect on what's best for us, you know, with our own, you know, inner nature. But I think one thing that perhaps is perhaps similar about all of us is that like sustainability is like really cool and really fun, you know, like if you're an enthusiast of it, you know, the idea of like putting on solar panels or get people to like care about like the embodied carbon of a plastic bottle, you know, for all of us who are into this stuff, like it's really fun and it's really interesting and it's really cool and it's really awesome. Despite various, you know, entrepreneurial leanings of our various personalities, I think that's one thing that we do all share is this, is that it's just so interesting. Like it's awesome. It's fun. Like it's curious. And to get in touch with that thing that we think is awesome about it. And that's what you were mentioning, like this sort of positivity or optimism through the book is really not a prediction of where I think the world is going to be. It's just an expression of my enthusiasm for just wanting to like nerd out on LCA papers on like plastic. Like it's just really, really interesting. And when you can fall in love with your own inner curiosity, you know, not driven by fear of the future planet, but driven by, you know, love of the science, love of the technology, and, you know, a vision for what we could have, you can draw your energy from that place. And I think when you get really real with your own inner sort of resonance with that place, it can destroy the sort of self-imposed barriers, you know, the psychological barriers we have, you know, that is genuinely scary to cold call people that you don't know and to, you know, put months of effort into something that you don't know how it's gonna turn out. We have a lot of these like mental, you know, barriers, the fear and the anxiety and the risk that it sort of gets in the way of doing anything. Everybody has them. But yeah, I just find just getting really resonant with that, you know, with that really raw kind of almost like primal energy of like why you're here, like why are we doing this? And getting really real with that, you know, can embolden you, you know, to be able to have more resonance, have more energy, and just sort of like shadow out, you know, all of those kind of like all of the constant problems, you know, that are in the way.
I think that probably links into your, I know you speak about in the book, finding your creative zone. And I found that amazing. I'm not gonna lie, I struggle sometimes to give myself that hour to sort of lock in. I don't know if you want to talk to sort of the creative zone and why it's so important.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like this creative zone stuff that I was talking about, I thought it would be more resonant, but I feel like it's like gets ignored all the time. And I kind of like, I've put out so much content and videos and stuff about it, and it doesn't really get taken up on as much as I would like, hardly gets taken up on at all. But yeah, it seems to be this totally like missing vacuum from like climate and environmental sustainability. It's inherently like a creative task. Like you're coming up with something that nobody's ever done before. You either need to invent like a product or a machine or a program or a communication strategy or a way to communicate data, like whatever it is, it involves doing something that nobody has done before, which is inherently a creative act, you know, and a lot of sustainability stuff has not been creatively delivered that well, you know, like the graphic design's been terrible, the storytelling hasn't been that great, you know, like it's the one thing that we can do better at, you know, to let's like anchor in to that creative energy and be like, if my sustainability work was a piece of art, like not in the conventional sense of a painting, but if this was my artwork, if this was going to be the most creatively excellent thing I could do, even if it's a report, you know, like, or a a webinar, like I'm just, or like a government conference, you know, just this carbon accounting, whatever. If that was an excellent piece of creative work, what would it be? And to get people to start more identifying with that kind of energy and stepping into that sort of energy. I mean, I started doing that about 10 years ago, and my life in the last 10 years has just been, is totally different. Like I'm just a completely different person. I have different skills. I do different stuff than I was before I started self-identifying that way and adding that as like a practice or a sort of a central way to the way I do stuff.
It's a really nice comment from Carrie. I hear your reverence for creativity is adjacent. I think so. Let's move on to some more questions. So Luke has asked, do you find that through your work you successfully activate groups of people who have an appetite for resources, tools, activities, and ways to contribute that are not yet available? So I guess they've locked into their creativity zone. They're trying to put things into action. And then he said, is there a policy or provision gap that would need to be filled if these approaches were to be widely taken up so that citizens or consumers don't get excited and then a bit stuck?
These questions, some of these questions are kind of like really sort of complicated and very top end umbrella. I mean, a lot of the times with the actual like software, there is not actually the data to work with. So a lot of the stuff I want to do, like I can't do because it's either only the government and the utilities that have the data and, you know, or the EPA, because, you know, we're dealing with the environment here, not Silicon Valley corporations. And they just don't put out APIs of the data to do the kind of like work I want to do. So in terms of a restriction, we are very restricted in that sense. If you want to do something just plain Silicon Valley style, there's loads of really advanced computer technology. You want to do something with like air pollution or urban heat islands or like, you know, forest cover. I mean, there's still stuff there, you know, but it's nowhere near the quality and the granularity, you know, that we really need. That's all I can sort of say.
Can I maybe posing a similar question, but maybe a more simplified version? One thing that I was thinking about when I was reading the book was there were so many brilliant examples that you mentioned about kind of the effect of the seatbelt and it beeping at you, a Toyota Prius and the screen, and how they've kind of show you the data so that when you're driving, you drive more efficiently. The plastic bag tax, and I loved your comment about we're trying to remove single-use plastic bags, but why has no one ever said to kind of do a campaign to remind you to bring your plastic bag when you leave the house? Like, it's so simple, but it's genius. Now I was thinking, how many times have I walked halfway down the street and gone, oh, I've left my plastic bag? If someone had done a campaign to remind me, that would have been brilliant. That would have changed my behavior. But when I think about these, there were loads of great examples, but I'm wondering, from your perspective, how come they haven't become more mainstream? Like, why have people not kind of latched onto these more? Like, the data's there, it shows that this works. And I know in the environmental space, it's novel, but in more general life, some of these practices have been in place for some time. Could you speak to that at all?
I mean, well, if you look at, I mean, just through the sustainability lens, I mean, sustainability is a fairly new profession. You know, like I did my environmental engineering degree between like 1997 and 2001. And it had only just first started to be offered a couple of years before I enrolled, you know, and it was one of the first ones. So it was only like in the late 90s when that as a degree, like, you know, environmental science, environmental engineering degrees sort of came out, right? And, you know, and then actually being as a profession where you could be like a sustainability manager, like at a city or at a company, you know, it was only really in the early 2000s where that started to become, you know, like a job that people had. So as a profession, like we're pretty young, right? We've got about 20 years as a profession, 10 years, last 10 years, it's sort of gotten more serious. So all of these, like the theories and the features that are in my book haven't gotten out into our profession, right? Yeah, it is obvious. Like, why not, you know, like a door hanger? Like, so the thing what in the book is like when I go to Trader Joe's, right, they give me stickers because I have a little girl, a 7-year-old girl, and they all offer her, you know, you get about 10 little like stickers, like a free thing for the kids, right? something that would be so easy. It would be like a little hanger that sits on your door. It could just be made of cardboard that says, don't forget to bring your bags, right? Why has no one ever done one of these? It would be like so easy, just like the stickers, you know, anyway, like little things, little low hanging fruit ideas like that. Yeah, so a reasonably new profession. And then, so these concepts, these kind of behavioral psychology, persuasive technology concepts that are more well known in other professions, you know, haven't really percolated through our very young profession. But this goes back into like the whole like creativity thing, you know, like I think we really just, if us as a profession, we're more on the front foot of self-identifying as being a creative force, then all of us can go and find, you know, this kind of knowledge, like what do game designers do? What do animators do? What do filmmakers do? All these different professions, and then we can learn, you know, we can learn from them and start using them. But also, like, I mean, in some issue, a huge challenge with sustainability is that how often we just are going against the economy. I know a lot of people want to sort of, this is like a style of like magical thinking where we think that sustainability can always be profitable all of the time. You know, I remember when I first started, everyone was like, we have to make it profitable. We have to make sustainable, green makes money, you know, and it sort of can in some ways, some of the time. But I mean, there's a kind of like a hard truth to it that like frequently it does make people more money to cut down the forest than to keep the forest, you know, unless you want to do this elaborate like ecological accounting. So our jobs and the work we do, like it just doesn't have the same economic drivers to it as other types of industries, which means that there's just not enough money, not enough momentum. People aren't listening to us as much. And, you know, so we are sort of squished, you know, to the back of the pile compared to the next big like finance app, you know, in Silicon Valley or Uber or something, you know, that's really riding, you know, with the economy rather than against the economy.
Brilliant. That was a great answer. So thank you for that. I saw John asked a question early on, which slipped through, but I think it's very interesting. And so maybe we'll ask that now. And recently there's been some, with the high inflation rates and the rising cost of living in the UK and further afield, there's fears that there may be an inbound recession as such. And so the question is kind of talking about behaviors in, how do behaviors change when the context we live in change? So word for word, his question is, my question is whether environmental psychology has much to say about how people as citizens, employees, consumers, investors, voters, think and behave differently in times of boom and recession, in times of peace and conflict that might relate to the wider climate, biodiversity, sustainability agenda in the next 3 to 5 years?
I've never looked up a study that answers that exact question, but there might be something done about it. I mean, they do so many different studies about how people's climate change attitudes are related to different, you know, sorts of things, you know, different demographics, everything. So anyway, I would say if you're really genuinely interested, Google like environmental psychology or environmental attitude is another great keyword to use, you know, related to, you know, sort of recession or finance. And there's people that do studies on all sorts of stuff all the time. But yeah, like, I mean, you know, people's relationship towards, you know, what they're going to do in their life and what information they're willing to take in is going to change depending on, you know, what's going on in their world and in their life. But one myth I try to dispel though with money and climate is that there's been this sense that doing green things is this boutique expensive thing to do, which it can be if you do it in the boutique expensive way. But if you just look at the raw data, like people's environmental footprint is pretty proportional to how much money they spend, sort of roughly. Like if you look at CO2 and GDP, you know, they're roughly pretty matched. GDP goes up, more economic activity, more environmental impact. That as we're saving money and we're spending less, the carbon emissions go down as well. So, and generally, you know, the most eco-friendly thing to do is to use the least. You know, it's not to buy the $50,000 Tesla, it's to walk. You know, it's not to buy the really elaborate organic food, it's just to have rice for dinner, just something, just basic, just really simple, unpackaged vegan food, potatoes, bananas. If anyone's ever been like a really poor student, you would understand that oats, potatoes, and bananas and lentils is what you eat when you have no money. And that's also the lowest environmental footprint food, not the fancy like organic sort of Whole Foods salad or whatever it is in the UK, wherever you shop. So, I mean, it's quite likely that even if people's environmental consciousness was not sort of front of mind during a recession, that the actual carbon emissions data would actually go down because people were spending less.
As a recent student, I'm going to add baked beans to that list. But I think there's a good question from Paul that kind of links to that, is sort of, does all the data and analysis ultimately gravitate towards degrowth? Do we just need to spend less, do less, emit? Obviously, we need to emit less, but is that where sort of all the data is pointing?
I mean, I think that question's probably a little bit outside my knowledge, because that's a more like serious economics question. But I would lean to, I'm not saying I definitely know that I'm correct, but I would lean to probably putting a pin in the, like a pin, like as in popping the balloon of the degrowth philosophy. Because traditionally, like carbon emissions and GDP have been sort of pretty matched, I think that they probably can uncouple with clean energy. And you have different parts of the economy, like you can have economic growth in one way that also causes the collapse of another, industry that is bad, right? So I say, for example, like iTunes, with like DVDs or cassette cases or whatever, right? So there was this enormous growth, right, in digital music and digital technology, right? So that would count as like economic growth, right? But then what happened was that all of the sort of plastic manufactured digital media went away, which is the environmental impact went away. So in that particular scenario, you've got economic growth, but you've also got the environmental impact taken away. So there are a lot of scenarios like that where you have growth, but you also have like the environmental impact go away. And so that's the kind of reason why like I would not get on the degrowth bandwagon, because growth can be measured in all these different ways. I think you just really want to just look at like the net impact. You're like, what is the CO2, whether it grows or whether it doesn't grow, it kind of doesn't really matter. Like it just, as long as the CO2 is going away and, the plants and animals are kind of protected, if we can grow an economy inside that in different ways, great.
Fab, thank you for that. I've just, Lucy's comment I think is wonderful. I think we should move on to that next. And this is the idea of, the question is, do government agencies and businesses need to build in more partnerships working with environmental psychologists? And if we think that's the case, how can we as a community here help to influence that? Yes, definitely.
But what I do think another missing piece that is also having like a great creative director, because there's one thing that I've noticed that's really missing is that environmental psychologists understand the theory. They're the sort of people who do PhDs in psychology and they publish academic papers. That's their nature, right? They are not people who do creative production. I'm more of a creative production person who has self-learned some environmental psychology, right? So if you get a whole bunch of like sustainability folks and a whole bunch of government folks together and a whole bunch of environmental psychologists, you may not be in much of a better situation. What you need is somebody who knows how to make great software, who knows how to produce advertising campaigns, to produce film, makes great audio, great video, who knows how to do copywriting, who knows like just like how to like produce the stuff, like even if it's just a sign, that says compost that goes on the trash, like you need that stuff done. And that's the stuff that I see more so as like the missing piece, is this really like top quality like delivery of like whatever anything needs to be made. But then is like, and then you've got like the environmental psychologist sort of like making sure that it's done, with the right kind of like theories. What can you do? I don't know, next time you have a meeting or you have a contract or a workshop, try to find a environmental psychologist person, you know, to advise on them. There's not that many of them around. They're mostly at universities. I mean, you can get me to do it, or you could find somebody from the Journal of Environmental Psychology that's authored a paper. There's no organization or like a talent agency that just farms them out. Start one. Somebody start environmental psychologist talent agency, farm out the environmental psychologist for calls and consulting in between doing their academic papers. But yeah, but just don't shortchange on the actual just like nuts and bolts creative production.
Well, I think that's I've got so much I want to say in we're out of time. I think what you said there about the creativity really struck home with me, because I'm quite a visual learner, and when I was reading the book, one thing that I sort of had to sit and think about is when you talk about the value action gap and the difference between educating and actually instigating action. I realized that a lot of the stuff that I've been sort of like, oh, I want to make a change there, is actually just educating. And so would you say that the creatives have a huge role to play in sort of moving from just education to action? So for example, the IPCC report, it's so important, it's got some great stuff in, but if you sit there and read it, it's quite tricky to read. It's very technical, sort of black and white font, it's a massive document. Would you say that the gap is sort of finding a way to communicate that?
No, not. Yeah, I mean, yes and no. Like an IPCC report is not meant to be a behavioral intervention. That's not its purpose. And if anybody's thinking that that's a behavioral intervention, then they're making an error, right? It's meant to be like a technical report, and that's its only job. So then people like put out a technical report and they were like, why didn't millions of people read it around the world and then start changing their behavior? I'm like, well, because it wasn't designed for that. So let's not think it should do that. I mean, and that was actually my job at the UN, was to get a UN report that was its sort of version of that, and then turn it into, you know, actionable things that people around the world could take, you know. And they genuinely thought, you know, like they thought that this big PDF report, they couldn't understand why people weren't just downloading it all the time and just doing stuff. It's like, well, you know, let's like break it up into some little bites first. But yeah, in terms of like the value action gap, I mean, if you want to get somebody to do a behavior, whether it's like contacting a politician or saving energy or whatever it is, you know, just you've got to work on that. You just got to work on the behavior. And you might need to get like little segments, like little bites of the cookie out of something like the IPCC report, some salient little bites, and then turn that into its own, you know, nugget and attach it to, you know, the behavior. But you just got to really think through the behaviors that you want people to do. People aren't going to learn something and then naturally change their behavior. Well, some people, like 1 in 100 people might, but most people won't. Like you've got to go in and just really think of it from the behavior, you know, up, not the like education up. Think of the education as just a little bit of help to make you get the behavior to happen, rather than it's just like the educational nugget in itself.
Fabulous. I'm aware that we're coming into the last 5 minutes. I think we've got one final question, which, just aware of time, maybe if we could answer in a couple of minutes, but we're both fascinated, and I'm sure the listeners on the call are fascinated to know, Katie, what is next for you? So what does the future look like for Katie Patrick? Where are you wanting to focus your attention? If you could speak to that for about 2 minutes before we wrap up, that would be fascinating to hear.
Sure, thanks. I'm developing a program at the moment to do sustainability gamification for like blocks of houses, working on the existing home upgrades. And I'm making these little maps where I put badges on the houses, on the map, not badges on the physical house, maybe on the physical house one day. And just going, you know, like door to door, like real human conversation, door to door. I mean, I've done years and years of internet marketing, and now I'm really of a mind that you just have to just get out to real people, like on the street, like 101, like door knocking, real humans talking, you know, about this stuff. And trying to encourage the actual like blocks, clubs, groups of people like in neighborhoods to get together to implement, you know, sustainability upgrades in their houses. So a bit of like real on the ground, like hands-on door knocking, and also sort of the gamification stuff, bringing that together. That's my next project I'll be working on. And yeah, I'll keep interviewing environmental psychologists on my podcast to help, you know, grow grow my understanding, you know, of this fascinating field.
Well, I mean, please keep us updated. We'll try and keep on top of that, and so we can keep everyone up to date on what you're doing. I'd also, like Josh said, we're coming to the end of the session, but I would also just reiterate Josh's sentiment early on. Listen to Casey's podcast because it is amazing.
Thank you.
Access that through Spotify. And there's lots of other resources. If you go on her website, there's some really great sort of images, and all the other projects Casey's doing are available on there. And the last thing from us, I would say, is as usual, we are going to be sending around a survey, which Alvaro will put in the chat. Thank you, Alvaro. And if you could fill that out, we would really appreciate it. Let us know what you thought, suggestions for future book clubs. Please don't be too harsh on us. Louise will review us when she's back. And if you do complete it, you'll be in with a chance of winning the next book for the book club. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Katie, for taking the time to talk to us. I think it's been a really brilliant session.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for having me. And I put my details at the top of the chat. If you scroll up, if anybody wants to reach out to me on like LinkedIn or I think my email is there, Twitter, podcast, whatever.
Fabulous. And just a quick thank you for everyone in the chat there. There were some great questions, some tricky questions as well. But it was great to kind of hear your thoughts as well. So thank you very much, everyone. And that's all from us tonight, is it?
I feel like we're news presenters, yes.